Fear is rarely born from danger itself. It is born from anticipation. Long before soldiers in World War II ever saw an enemy, they were already fighting something inside their own minds. Sleepless nights, imagined scenarios, and the silent question of whether they would endure what was coming shaped their thoughts more than any weapon. The battlefield first appeared as an idea, not a place. In that space between thought and reality, anxiety took control. For them, the enemy had not yet fired a shot, but fear had already begun its work. The mind tried to predict pain, loss, and death, believing that preparation meant control. Yet this effort only deepened the sense of helplessness. What these men would soon discover was not how to defeat fear, but how to recognize its true source. The first battle was never against another soldier. It was against the belief that everything had to be understood before it could be faced. This moment of realization connects their experience to yours. The same force that trapped them in anticipation now traps many in worry about the future. Their story begins not with combat, but with the quiet collapse of certainty. When soldiers first faced the enemy, something inside them broke and reformed at the same time. The idea of war vanished and was replaced by a human presence standing only meters away. Accounts recorded by historians such as Anthony Beaver describe how men froze, not from lack of courage but from the shock of recognition. The enemy was no longer a symbol. He had a face, a voice, and a weapon. In that instant, training dissolved under emotion. Some could not move. Others felt detached from their own bodies as if watching themselves from outside. Fear became physical. Breath shortened. Vision narrowed. Time slowed. This was not weakness. It was the mind reacting to the collapse of illusion. What they thought they understood was replaced by what they could not control. Yet within this fracture, a new awareness emerged. Survival no longer depended on imagining outcomes, but on meeting the present moment exactly as it was. The encounter did not teach them how to win. It taught them how to remain standing inside uncertainty. This shift would soon become the foundation of inner discipline. What followed the first encounter was not courage, but exhaustion from resistance. Veterans later described a quiet turning point when they understood that much of what surrounded them lay beyond their power. Weather, orders from command, the movements of the enemy, and even the possibility of death could not be negotiated with. These forces existed without asking permission. The mind suffered most when it tried to argue with them. In the words preserved by historians such as Max Hastings, soldiers learned this lesson not through theory but through repetition. Panic wasted strength. Anger blurred judgment. The struggle to control the uncontrollable drained what little clarity remained. Slowly, a different logic took shape. If the outside world could not be ruled, then attention must be ruled instead. Breath became steadier. Posture became deliberate. The next decision became the only territory worth defending. This was the birth of an inner boundary. Everything beyond it belonged to fate. Everything within it belonged to will. Acceptance was not resignation. It was the discovery of where effort still mattered. In this narrow space between chaos and choice, the soldier found something stronger than fear, a sense of order that no enemy could take away. The true battlefield was no longer outside. It had moved inward. Veterans spoke of two forces competing for command of their thoughts. Fear tried to run ahead of reality, predicting pain, loss, and failure before anything had happened. Reason worked in the opposite direction. It narrowed life to what could be done in the next moment. One breath, one movement, one decision. This conflict did not erase emotion. It organized it. Fear became a signal rather than a master. Discipline became a shelter rather than a rule. What separated collapse from survival was not bravery, but mental structure. Reason built order where panic had ruled. It did not ask for certainty. It asked only for attention. Through this shift, soldiers learned that emotional chaos could not be eliminated, but it could be guided. The enemy outside still existed, but the enemy within lost its power to command every thought. In this quiet struggle, a new strength appeared, one that did not depend on victory, only on clarity. To accept fate was not to abandon hope. It was to stop fighting what could not be changed. Soldiers learned that survival required a strange balance, to prepare for death without seeking it, and to live fully inside uncertainty without pretending it did not exist. This acceptance did not make them passive, it made them precise. Energy once spent on fear was redirected toward action. Accounts described by historians such as Richard Overy reveal that courage was not loud or dramatic, it was quiet and deliberate. It appeared when a man chose to move forward without demanding guarantees. Fate no longer felt like an enemy. It became a condition of existence. Within that condition, choice still mattered. This understanding reshapes how strength is defined. True resilience did not come from controlling the outcome, but from meeting it with reason. Acceptance became a form of discipline, and discipline became freedom from emotional collapse. In learning to live beside uncertainty, soldiers discovered a steadiness that fear could no longer easily disturb. The battlefield has changed, but the struggle has not. Today, the enemy rarely stands in uniform before us. It appears as uncertainty about work, fear of illness, tension in relationships, and the constant demand to predict what cannot be known. What once arrived as gunfire now arrives as thought. Anxiety is no longer tied to survival alone, but to the belief that every outcome must be controlled before peace is allowed. The soldiers of World War II learned that suffering increased when the mind tried to command events instead of itself. This lesson carries forward into modern life with quiet precision. Emotional slavery begins when fear is mistaken for foresight. The need to secure the future becomes the very force that unsettles the present. Seen through this mirror, the enemy is not circumstance. It is the habit of resistance. Freedom does not come from removing danger, but from changing one's relationship to it. When control is placed where it belongs, inside the will and not outside in events, the mind steps out of conflict with reality. What was once perceived as threat becomes something else entirely, a challenge to practice clarity. The lessons drawn from those first encounters in World War II were not meant to remain in memory, they were meant to be practiced. Veterans did not calm their minds by waiting for fear to disappear, they acted within it. The first step was to name what could not be controlled. Weather, outcomes, and the reactions of others were placed outside the circle of effort. This simple recognition reduced confusion and restored direction. Next came the deliberate choice of what still belonged to the will. Attention was brought back to breath, posture, and the single task at hand. In this narrow field, reason could operate without being drowned by emotion. Fear no longer spread across the future. It stayed inside the present moment, where it could be managed. Finally, emotion was not suppressed, but examined. When anxiety rose, it was met with understanding rather than panic. Reason did not argue with feeling, it translated it into action. This is how inner order is built, not through force, but through practice. The battlefield becomes a classroom, and the mind becomes steady by learning where its true authority lies. Fear does not disappear when understanding arrives. It remains, as it did for those who once stood before an enemy for the first time. What changes is its position. It no longer governs every thought. It becomes a presence that can be observed rather than obeyed. Veterans did not leave the war free from uncertainty. They left with a different relationship to it. The future was still unknown, but the mind had learned where to stand. This new steadiness was not built on optimism, it was built on clarity. They understood that fate would continue to unfold beyond their command, yet their inner posture could remain intact. Reason offered structure where chaos once ruled. Acceptance removed the need to fight reality. In this balance, fear lost its authority without losing its meaning. The journey ends without triumph and without illusion. The world remains unpredictable, life remains fragile. What has changed is the way the mind meets these truths. The same shift is now available to you. Not the promise of safety, but the promise of composure. Not control over events, but command over perception. This is the quiet strength carried from the battlefield into ordinary life, a strength that does not seek to conquer fear, but to understand it and live without being ruled by it.